fluffed out. Hey, James, you're actually in quarantine in a hotel.
I am in hotel prison.
Yeah, is that what it feels like? What day are you up to?
Yeah, we've had four nights.
Okay, all right. How long do you have to be in there for?
Well, we were lucky. We got in at 11 at night, so technically 23. We can get out at 23 hours early,
Right.
1 minute after midnight.
Right.
We're spending our time watching The Shawshank Redemption, so I can escape.
So exactly what city are you in?
Brisbane.
Okay, and you've come back from where to Australia?
From London. We took our life in our hands, risked our life, and spent 7 weeks in London with our kids.
And here you are. You seem to be okay.
Made it. Yeah. One of the 1% who made it.
Yeah. All right. Hey, James, really appreciate you joining us, and certainly in the circumstances that you're in as well. So what are you going to talk about?
Well, I was going to come at it from, given the very eminent people you've had speak, I'll just quickly recount where I agree with just about everything, and then hit a few things that relate more to my area, a little bit of skepticism of policy making, the philosophical attitudes we're going to need to try to change this. And if anybody has any legal questions at the end, I'll do what I can, but I'm not very optimistic on that front either.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Us neither. All right. Skeptical point of view. We like that. That's what we're all about. I'll throw it over to you. We've got the full hour to your presentation and to have answers to questions. And things.
Well, I was instructed to do 20 minutes and the rest questions, so I'm going to live up to that. Hopefully.
Okay.
Fingers crossed.
That'll be fine. Do you have you got a presentation you want to put up?
I'm just going to speak.
Okay.
There was no way I could get to anything else. So let me begin by apologizing to everybody. It's pretty basic here at the Grand Chancellor Hotel. I just had the entire internet collapse on me. I'd like to start by thanking Michael and Mark for having included me with such distinguished company. I know that I'm the last slot of the night. We used to call that the death slot. So it's me standing between a lot of Kiwis and alcohol. And I know after 11 years living in Dunedin, that's a pretty precarious place to be standing. Let me advise you, as Mark's already done, that I'm giving my talk from prison. Not literally from prison, but pretty close. My wife and I are in a tiny room in hotel quarantine in Brisbane. We are forbidden from setting foot out of our room for 2 weeks. So we don't even get a half hour of prison yard exercise. The Queensland Chief Medical Officer has intoned that that's not necessary. People don't need to go outside. We've come in from the airport on Monday night with puritanical police. Friends can drop stuff off. We've had friends drop wine off, but the police regulate how much of the wine will be sent up to your room. I called down when I heard this and asked if I'd inadvertently joined the Methodist Church. And the whole quarantine has been steeped in a sort of lunacy. When we were being bussed in from the airport to the hotel with all the other inmates spaced, we got to the hotel and this preachy senior police officer got on the bus at the hotel, told us that we were all potentially infected, that the big strapping 8 or 9 police officers standing around would not be able to touch any of our luggage under the bus. This is after the Australian Defence Force had taken all of our bags and put them on the bus, and all of the baggage handlers at the airport had obviously handled our bags. But these big strapping Queensland police officers just stood there, and we were taken off the bus one at a time. And the first person to get off was an elderly lady, and it was just appalling. She was trying to crawl under the bus to get her luggage. And finally, the bus driver, who was obviously a private contractor, he just finally got up out of his seat, walked around and took everyone's bag off the bus while all of these police officers watched. You know, if those 9 police constables aren't ashamed of themselves, they should be. So at any rate, I'm speaking to you from hotel quarantine, very basic internet. So if for no other reason, that might make my talk memorable. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a law professor, a legal philosopher. At legal conferences, it's customary always to start with a quick joke. And because I was recounting some of the idiocies, and there's a lot more if anybody has any questions afterwards about the lockdown, hotel quarantines, I've got a lot of stories. But as I was recounting them, I was reminded of the story of the lockdown skeptic, people like me and many of you, most of you. He was fresh from reading that day's issue of Toby Young's Lockdown Skeptic, which is just excellent, as many of you will know. He was partaking of his Boris-approved daily outdoor walk, not wearing a mask, and he stumbled over this ancient-looking bottle, which he inadvertently rubbed. Jeannie comes out of the bottle, and she tells the skeptic, "Look, I'm a very special genie. You get 3 wishes, but everything you wish for, all of the proponents of lockdowns around the world will get twice what you get. So I have to tell you, whatever you get, they're going to get twice." So he thought about it. For his first wish, he said, "Okay, I'd like a German sports car." So the genie blinked her eyes. She said, "There's a BMW waiting in your driveway." And she said, "But I have to tell you, I have to remind you yet again that Neil Ferguson now has 2 BMWs to drive to meet his little bit on the side. And all the lockdown proponents have two BMWs. And what's your second wish?" And he goes, "Oh, quite like $1 million." So she blinks her eyes and she says, "Now you have $1 million, but Matt Hancock has $2 million. And the governor of New York, Cuomo, has $2 million. And all the proponents of hard lockdowns have $2 million. So what would you like for your third and final wish?" And our lockdown skeptic thinks for a bit. He says to the genie, "I've always wanted to donate a kidney." Okay, right. So with that out of the way, it goes without saying that I'm a lockdown skeptic. I've been writing skeptical pieces about this lockdown in my Spectator Australian column since, March last year. I think I was one of the very earliest of subscribers to Toby Young's Lockdown Skeptic newsletter. And by the way, he does God's work, Toby does. He not only in his spare time runs the Lockdown Skeptics, he is the organizer and founder of the Free Speech Union, which supports members who are being canceled for articulating views that 5 years ago were considered to be completely middle of the road normal. It is a wonderful organization. He does that. He does the Lockdown Skeptics, and those are not his full-time job of being the deputy editor of the Spectator. I've written a few law review articles on civil liberties infringing aspects of lockdowns, and of course there's loads of those, how they have massively more negative impact on the young than they do on the old, how lockdowns hit the poor more than the rich, private sector people more than public sector people. And because of that sort of basic reading, and given the eminent speakers in front of me on the hard facts, let me just say that I know the basics, that COVID hits the old far more than the old, and vulnerable more than the young. For many young people, it's no more lethal than all sorts of things we don't even think twice about. The average age of COVID deaths in many places is higher than the life expectancy for males and females. The money government is spending to prop up the economy that they themselves have decimated with lockdowns is just staggering. In Australia, it's staggering on steroids. In per capita terms, I believe we're the most profligate spending economy propping up government in the world. The central government debt in Australia has doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. And that's before you add in all the state government debt. If that debt is monetized, of course, and assets inflate, which is probably more likely than taxes increasing, then again, the old who own assets will win and the young will lose again. And you have to remember that in Australia, there have been fewer than 1,000 COVID deaths. Most of those were in the state of Victoria with an incredibly hardline lockdown premier. And most of the deaths in Victoria were actually intern and old age home extended care type facilities. So the dollar costs around the world, but especially in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the dollar cost per life saved. And this is if you assume that lockdowns actually do something. So let's assume that Governors Newsom, Como, Neil Ferguson, let's assume they're right. I don't think they are, but even if they are right, the dollar cost per life saved have been in the tens and tens of millions, probably more. In Australia, certainly more. I assume the same as in New Zealand. If we talk in terms of quality adjusted life years, the jargon that the doctors will be familiar with, and if we remember the massive skew of the virus's lethality towards the old and sick, what's the jargon, with those with comorbidities, then the fiscal cost to produce the right results we're getting are just actually astronomical. And what staggers me is this is a world where last year, if you looked at something like the pharmaceutical benefit scheme and what the public purse would pay for drugs for rare diseases, they would cut off the tap at levels of money that are orders of magnitude lower than what they're spending per life saved now. So I don't know what the cutoff is. Nobody really mentions this figure, but let's assume it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for some drug for a rare disease. It certainly wasn't in the millions and not anywhere near what people are spending now. And as my new friend whom I've met through the lockdown skeptic, Ramesh, who spoke before me, he and I are quite odd. We both have a connection to Queen's University. We both have a connection to the Otago University. I spent 11 years there and he was there a bit longer, but I don't think we overlapped. I think he left the year before I got there in 1993, but it was close anyway. This lockdown has had staggering effects on the people in the third world. Poverty's gone up in the hundreds of millions, and that's got to translate into huge numbers of deaths. And this just goes on and on. So I'm sure that all the people before me, I haven't been able to listen because of the lousy internet, but I'm sure that all the eminent people have gone through this in far better detail and with more knowledge that I can bring to the table. So instead, I'm just briefly going to play to a few of my strengths. I'm going to look at lockdowns from a non-medical, non-modeling perspective. And I really just want to voice three types of skepticism. So here's skeptical point number one. And given the audience, no offense. So no offense to all the doctors in the audience today, but I am very, very skeptical of giving the sort of power that democratically elected leaders around the world have given to doctors, and especially to public health doctors, right? So for what it's worth, I've spent a big part of my academic career, such as it is, attacking bills of rights, overpowerful judges, the sort of lawyerly caste of which I'm a part, and basically the sort of undemocratic juristocracy that has emerged in many jurisdictions around the world. I know the lawyerly caste. I'm part of it. I know top judges. And as I've said in print many times, when you buy things like a Bill of Rights, all you're buying is the moral druthers of the top judiciary. I'm quite attracted to a famous sentiment of William Buckley, who once said that he'd rather be governed by the first 1,000 people listed in the Boston phone book than by the faculty members of Harvard University, any Ivy League university, perhaps, he said. Actually, I think that's right. I've argued it applies to the Anglophile's top common law judges, to all my professional colleagues. And I think one thing the pandemic has shown us, at least it's shown me, is that the same sort of skepticism ought to apply to public health doctor types. I'm generalizing, of course, there's always outliers, but given that qualification, generally speaking, it seems to me that many of the people like judges, when it comes to thinking about rights, have a lot of deficiencies. I'll just go through a few of them. The sort of public health doctor types, chief medical officers, Dr. Fauci's of the world, they are close to being economically illiterate. I don't want to say they're completely economically illiterate, but if you got me at a bar over a few beers, I'd probably go that far. So that's the first problem. Secondly, they're too inclined to shun cost benefit thinking. In other words, they're absolutists. The same sort of thing you get with a lot of human rights thinking. They become absolutists. They're focused solely on this one particular goal they've been given. Might change. It might start with flattening the curve, and then it might move to suppression, and then it might move to eradication. But that's their one single-minded goal or pursuit. They pursue it as if it had no concomitant attendant effects and as though nothing else matters. And thirdly, they aren't particularly good at weighing the non-medical costs and benefits. And when I say non-medical, I mean the immediately non-medical consequences. So obviously, in a sense, all of these things will have long-term medical effects, but in the short term, they don't care about lost businesses. They don't care about lost years of schooling for children, which can have incredible effects down the road. They don't seem to care at all about lost civil liberties, all the damage being done to democracy, and they are staggering. All of that is off their radar. All these and more have been undoubtedly affected by these lockdowns. And as a cohort or as a group, doctors seem to me to be pretty much useless on these three fronts. Here's a fourth element that doctors seem to be deficient, in my terms. These medico-type people have been given a lot, too much last word power by what can only be described as gutless, pusillanimous politicians. So I know it's been done under the banner of following the science, or these people are the oracles of the last word when it comes to science. And this is pushed aside far too much, counterbalancing economic concerns. Almost none of the SAGE type groups have hard-nosed economists in the room. So the raw cost of the lockdown, costs that over time have health effects, that doesn't really get a look in. And too many of these medical types, Queensland Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Fauci, the kind of people advising Boris Johnson, they have seemingly very little concern for civil liberties type concerns. If anything, the sort of public health attitude is a very top-down, we know best authoritarian attitude. And so that's my first sort of point of skepticism. It has this sort of whole pandemic and the heavy-handed lockdowns have shown us that we want to keep doctors farther away from having such last word sort of calls, in my view. How we go about sort of tempering the input they've had is another matter. Here's a second bit of skepticism. This one's a little bit more foundational. So I'm a legal philosopher. I'm skeptical about the role that, this hit me about 2 or 3 months ago, and I'm skeptical about the role that facts and data have been playing and do play in this debate between lockdown proponents and those who prefer a more Swedish, Taiwanese type, let's protect the vulnerable, but stay open as much as we can type proponents. So the Barrington Declaration people in that debate, at least as it plays out amongst the wider public, I have become very skeptical. And I hope nothing's happening because I'm getting a message again saying that my internet is unstable. At any rate, I'll press on and hope it isn't.
James, we're still getting you fine, so carry on.
Okay, great. In that debate, my hunch is that sentiments, feelings, sort of attitudes and emotions are doing a lot more of the work in dividing opinion in people. So one of my sort of intellectual heroes, the great Scottish philosopher David Hume, on related matters long ago in the late 1700s, he sort of made this point. He famously said that when it comes to moralizing and morality, this is overwhelmingly not a function of reason, by which Hume meant sort of causal reason, cause and effect reason, not the sort of grandiose German philosopher Kantian type reason. But Hume thought that feelings and sentiments and emotions do most of the work. And this looks true to me as regards what we're seeing with a lot of aspects of this pandemic and the response to the pandemic. So with much of the press leaning towards what I would call fear porn reporting and the sort of overt moralizing of the pro-lockdown policies and the heavy-handed government response. So they push the idea that to be a good person, you have to, someone who values people's lives, you have to be in favor of the lockdown. Now, I know Ramesh, before my internet cut off, ran through some of the sort of North Korean style propaganda that is everywhere in London. I could mention some more. I was staggered. You saw it on the British Telecom Tower. You saw it on all the posters in the bus stops that Ramesh mentioned. But it's not the facts and the data, at least not by themselves, that are going to sort of help the anti-lockdown side turn the tide in this debate. At least that's my fear, or that's what I suspect. As Ramesh pointed out, the propaganda is everywhere in London. Interestingly enough, with these posters where they all start off, look him in the eye, and they show some person in the hospital with an oxygen mask and tell him, and then it would say that you really do have to go into the office to work, or that you really don't need to wear a mask, or that this really isn't all that serious. And they're all aimed at your emotions, and Ramesh gave some good counterexamples you could go with. Interestingly, on all the posters I saw, the purportedly sick person who was lying in the hospital never was the median age of 83. They were like 40-year-olds or even younger. And so that was straight out manipulation, right? But they were all aimed at the emotions. And I think this largely works to make people feel, not think, but feel that the moral response, the moral response is to be in favor of lockdowns, to be in favor of masks, to be in favor of citizens not being forbidden to leave the country, as we are in Australia, in favor of very strict hotel quarantine arrangements. And if you voice any skepticism, you're not confronted with facts. You're confronted with the sort of virtue signaling sense that you're an evil person. My children, who are 27 and 25 in London, it's where they live and work, why we were over there for 7 weeks. Many of their friends just won't go outside at that age. They've had inculcated into them this feeling that they'd be a bad person. And so my skepticism or my suspicion is that you're going to need to play the same game to counter that. Might be distasteful, but some of the suggestions Ramesh had were pretty good. We could have pictures of thousands of people in the third world and say, look them in the eye and tell them lockdowns are working, anything like that. One of the eye-opening things about this whole pandemic response, for me at least, is how can you put this? How compliantly and easily and uncomplainingly your average citizen has responded to his or her civil liberties being taken away. And I just didn't think that would happen. So I've been completely surprised by that. But the sort of core level freedoms that in the developed Anglosphere, the freedoms that our ancestors took centuries to win, many of them have gone just like that. And very few people have complained. A lot of voters have been scared into supporting this stuff. As I said, it's become a sign of moral virtue. And I don't know that we're going to win it back with data and facts, depressing as that is, or at least we're not going to win it back with data and facts on their own. I think we have to shame people really shame them into realizing how easily they've thrown these things away without really complaining at all. I mean, I was cheering on the Italian restaurateurs who decided to open in the face of the Italian lockdown. I actually thought that more of that would happen in the English-speaking countries, but the Brits have become completely ovine, as far as I can tell, sheep-like, and Australia's just as bad. So that's a skeptical second point. Let's check the time here. last skepticism, I'll make this the last one. I'll finish with this one. Let me put it this way. There was a very quirky but interesting writer, Nasip or Nicholas Taleb. If you know him, you'll probably know him from his first book. It was entitled The Black Swan. It was really related to how most people are basically useless when it comes to thinking about probability. You know, our brains haven't evolved to be very good with probability. Terribly written book in terms of prose, but a very interesting book. His most recent book came out in 2018. It was titled Skin in the Game. And his thesis in that most recent book is that people with skin in the game, so people who are directly affected by the decisions they make, will over time tend to make better decisions. In fact, he thinks they make far better decisions. And so one of the things this pandemic response and government decision has shown us is that it's been a case study in people with no skin in the game making all of the key decisions. So the less skin you have in the game, the more say you've had in making the decisions. So politicians don't lose their jobs when they bring in hardline lockdowns. The top civil servants don't lose their jobs. Some big level sort of crony capitalism people don't lose their jobs when they order these lockdowns. Doctors don't lose their jobs, and epidemiologists don't. Neil Ferguson not only doesn't lose his job, he can drive over and see his girlfriend. It staggers me that man who, as far as I can tell, has never in his professional life made a correct prediction, and he appears still to be on the group that is advising Boris Johnson, the SAGE group. I mean, you just have to, it's staggering. Australia's Prime Minister Morrison, a little less frequently recently, but for near on a year, was repeatedly saying we're all in this together. You can't imagine a statement that is less accurate factually. It's just basically a patent lie. So the multitude of small business owners who have lost, or once the sort of steroid-driven levels of government support come off, will lose their businesses. And with all small businesses, or virtually all small businesses, the ability to set up the small business almost always involves taking out some sort of mortgage with the banks. So pledging the family home, they all have to pledge the family home. So not only are they going to lose their business, they're all going to lose their family home up to the level of bankruptcy law protection. It's not true for them that they're in it together with the politicians, bureaucrats, public health doctors. That latter groups, they're actually bearing none of the costs. In fact, their pay is the same. For many of the bureaucrats, their pay has gone up in the last year. Certainly true in Australia and some of the jurisdictions, their pay has gone up. The status of the people making these decisions that I think have been woefully bad decisions, their status has gone up too, right? Nothing like appearing every day before the cameras as the chief medical officer. And, basically in many jurisdictions, I mentioned no names in particular, but the chief medical officers are basically the least adept, least accomplished and talented of the medical cohort they started off with, and that might be a slight exaggeration, but they're certainly not at the top. But now their status has gone right through the roof. And so truth be told, these sort of groups will come out of these lockdowns materially better off. And if you look at it in comparative terms or sort of purchasing power terms, when a big chunk of society comes out of these things terribly, in material terms, they're going to come out of these, the decision makers are going to come out of these lockdowns in much better terms. They'll also enjoy a sort of self-satisfied, smug, albeit false sense that they've saved the world. You can think of Neil Ferguson, the Dr. Fauci's of the world, the Dan Andrews of the world, St. Jacinda. So these decision-making elites have deemed their own jobs to be essential. notice that when you have an essential job, your kids continue to go to school, so their children won't be suffering the costs of all of the children whose schooling has been interrupted in some places for over a year. So they're going to pick up a whole year on their kids will pick up a whole year on the other kids. And the list of the ways in which they have no skin in the game goes on and on, including, I might add, that when politicians and top bureaucrats in Australia return from overseas, they do not, let me say that again, they do not have to hotel quarantine. They can go and quarantine at home with a little thing saying, of course, they have to be careful, but, you know, if anything should make your blood boil, not just those of us who are in day 5 of hotel imprisonment, that even when it comes to something like hotel quarantine, the strictest in the world, these people who are making decisions aren't paying those costs. You know, I can remember when we first got married, my wife and I, we went off to Moscow in 1986 when we were living in London, got married, 2 Canadians went off to London, and we decided to take a week in Moscow. I think it was 1986. And I was stunned at the time that in parts of Moscow, there were lanes on the roads that only members of the Communist Party could drive on. And so in a weird kind of way, I feel like we've gone back to, there are one set of rules for all of the losers, and then there's another set of rules for the decision makers. They're too important to play by the rules. One exception, I suppose, is the press. You know, that sure, this is everything I've said is true of the ABC or the public broadcasters in New Zealand, Canada. They're not paying any of it. They have no skin in the game. You know, the government's not too witless and too frightened to cut their funding. But it's not true of big chunks of the non-public broadcasters. And for some reason, even though they do have skin in the game, because advertising revenues have dropped off a cliff, they have collapsed. Many of their publications are going to go broke, bankrupt, they're going to lose their jobs. And yet they still are, most of those people are still, you know, totally unskeptical about the cost of lockdowns. It's, you know, no one in the US, virtually nobody is reporting the sort of thing I'm sure Ramesh reported on, say comparing Florida to New York. Florida has adopted a very Swedish type approach, very trying not to close businesses. They have far more elderly people than New York. And yet when you look at deaths per million, Florida has 1,322 and New York has 2,346 as of 2 days ago. And New Jersey is slightly more. If you look at the unemployment rate, Florida's is at least 2 percentage points below New York's. I mean, New York is the worst in the world, except for New Jersey. And American members of the press are, you know, reporting New York as a success story. It's staggering. If we return to this last point of skepticism of mine, and I'll conclude, the former retired top British judge, Lord Sumption, who's an eminent skeptic, as you'll all know, he has characterized the last year, certainly across the Anglosphere, and rightly in my view, as having delivered the worst inroads on our civil liberties in 200 years. Worse than the inroads during the Second World War, worse than the inroads during the First World War. You know, and I think that when you look at it, it's just undeniable. It seems to me that would never have happened if the decision makers who are making these calls had a dollop of skin in the game. So if the lockdowns they were ordering had lost them their jobs and their pensions and their children's educations and their ability to travel overseas, we would have seen a far more nuanced and Taiwanese type response in my view, or at least let me put it this way. The last year has made it plain that decision-making by people with no skin in the game is less than ideal. So that's my 3 bits of skepticism. I can see with the time I've got to stop. Let me again thank the organizers for the symposium. Any listeners foolish enough to have forsaken a beer to listen, thank you too. And I'm going to stop with that. If anything happened to the internet, I apologize for that too.
No, thank you, James. It was smooth, mostly all the way through. So, and we heard it. I think we heard everything you had to say, which is great. Just a comment on the skin in the game point. I don't think it's ever been any different. The governing classes never have skin in the game. But what they've relied on in the past, so in a democracy at least, are two bits of information that help them judge whether or not they can get away with, as I think we heard in the UK, they described their own law changes, whether they can get away with the rules. And one is data, or they can get away with the effects of their policies. One is data, and data, as others have said over the course of these presentations, has been poor and delayed. The other is public response, or which they have either suppressed, has been not reflected by media, and in most cases not really. Oh, actually, in New Zealand's case, it has. In terms of an election, has not been put to a vote.
So Mark, I guess I would start at the beginning and just say, if you look at something like the First World War, the people making the decisions had a lot of skin in the game. More people from the upper class died in the First World War. Everyone's kids were sent to war. Everyone had skin in the game. The same was true in the Second World War. I mean, everyone, Churchill had as much skin in the game as everybody else, up until maybe the Vietnam War, when the sort of, the better off people tend not to have kids in the military. Not always true. McCain had, and there are people in the US who have a tradition of having their kids go in the military. But I don't think it's always been the case that decision makers don't have skin in the game. I think this particular instance is a particularly egregious example of the people making the calls bearing almost none of the consequences. I mean, they can't even bring themselves barely to limit the pay rise of the civil service. It is that pathetic. And I think you're right. I don't think they started off this way. I think someone like Boris Johnson's initial inclinations were on the civil liberties side of things. But you're right. They have found it very hard to stand up to the sort of authoritarian heavy-handedness. I am in awe of the Prime Minister of Sweden, who has stood up to this sort of thing. Or better yet, maybe the best example is Governor DeSantis in Florida, who has been pilloried for months and months and months, accused of being, basically a murderer. And he has not backed down, and his results have shown that he was right. He will get no credit from that. I think a lot of the problem is today's journalistic class is pathetic. Part of that I would trace back to the universities where I work. I mean, the kind of people who go to journalism school at the universities have some of the lowest, they might be slightly better than people who go to do teachers college, but they have some of the lowest results. And back when journalists used to learn on the job as apprentices, you got some great journalists. But spending 4 years in university learning grievance politics and sort of neo-Marxist platitudes is not good training to be a critical thinking journalist. So, I don't know all of the causes, but I think it's been particularly bad this last time.
Boris Johnson apparently said in private that he was surprised at how easy it had been to make these policy changes to limit people's freedoms. That for some time early in early last year, there was lots of discussion in cabinet, people saying, people won't stand for that. We've only got certain limits that things we could do, but they just kept pushing them, and there was no response. So, I think it seems to me that the fear that was generated is the reason why there was no response. So really, it falls to the leaders to make those decisions. They can't just wait until there's a public response if the public is already basing its decision on poor information.
I think you're right. I think it was partly the fear. It's just, I just now started confronting people, and there is an element of politeness. Someone asks you to wear a mask to come into a store, you just put it on, because that's what polite people do. I also think one of the driving factors is that in the last year or two, politicians have decided that future budget deficits don't matter at all.
Yes.
And this moronic modern monetary theory and the idea that we can spend and there'll be no long-term consequences at all. If you were paying the costs of the job seeker, job keeper, massive subsidies, if you were paying those as you went, this would have collapsed a long time ago. And so I still believe that 10 years from now, people will look back and these politicians will be pilloried, and this will be seen as the worst public policy disaster in the last century. But it's going to take a while for that to come true. You can't keep up this level of near propaganda level, emotive fear porn, fear mongering. And once the costs hit home, because there are going to be a lot of people whose lives are ruined, we'll see some effects. But I think it's going to be another 4 or 5 years down the road before we see them. I agree that I thought it would happen right away. I thought, Australians see themselves as this larrikin sort of crowd, but as a Canadian, and you can't get a more compliant. Canadians have more backbone than Australians. I mean, Australians have just fallen in line in the most pathetically compliant way, and it seems to me that Kiwis are even worse. And all our Australian friends here say, "Well, this is great. We have no cases." And I go, "Well, yeah, but what are you going to do? Are you going to never open your foreign borders? Do you think you're going to keep the virus out forever?" And the vaccines aren't going to keep out. They're not. I mean, we closed down now for one case. Well, the vaccines aren't going to stop every case. So I just don't know what the long-term plan is.
No, that has been a problem in itself. That it's been responses to the data on the day. There certainly doesn't appear to have been a long-term plan in general. Although in New Zealand, we did say we had one. We said we were going to eliminate the virus, at least locally, and then wait for a vaccine. That was the long-term plan. But other countries don't seem to have been quite as put it in so many words, whether they're right or wrong. Hey, I wondered. It's an interesting point you raise around Neil Ferguson and others, and even Fauci. It doesn't seem that someone's getting things wrong, and in this world where you can see the evidence of what they said in the past and how wrong they are now, it appears that let's call them the governing elite, they just don't seem to be. They're never held to account for these things, and yet, an ordinary member of the public who 10 years ago might have gone to a fancy dress party wearing something that's now considered inappropriate would probably lose their job instantly.
I mean, Neil Ferguson is a great example. So not only have his predictions, his modeling on this been terrible, he was orders of magnitude wrong on BSE, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, whatever it's called, mad cow disease. His predictions there were completely crazy. There was another thing to do with animals. His modeling was massively wrong. And it seems to be that if you say that 1 billion people will die and you're wrong, nobody cares. But if you say 2 people will die and actually 3 do die, you are held up as this man who had caused a death. And so it's all weighted in the weirdest kind of way. It is actually hard to understand. You would have thought that if anyone would have lost his job, it's that man, but he apparently hasn't. I don't know if it's a psychological thing. I have no reason. I can't understand why, if you're in the business of offering predictions, and this takes us back to Talib, when it's your own money on the line and you're making calls about if you don't get it right, you're just basically not eating. Whereas these people are playing with house money, and when they lose, they get more house money. It's very odd.
Hey, so I take it you don't believe in experts?
I believe in experts, but they need to be cabined, and they need to not be the ones making the final calls. And in an ideal world, the politician has, they do the way Churchill did. You have in the room a bunch of experts, and you go out of your way to have skeptics and naysayers in the room too. So your job is to listen, to have someone in the room who disagrees with the person you normally inclined to listen to. So at least you get a sense of, the other side of the argument, and you make the call, not just listening to some public health expert, but the best sort of economist you can find, and someone who has a sense of what's going to happen in all sorts of different areas. And then you put a few contrarians in the room too. And then of course the politician has to make the call. That doesn't seem to me to be what's been happening.
No, you're very right. That
I mean, this is going to throw people off, but the person who was doing the best job outside of Sweden and Taiwan was Trump. And, of course, people hate Trump. And maybe that's been a factor in this, too, that the press hated Trump so much they wanted the pandemic to be as bad as possible. But even Trump didn't have the cojones to stand up to Fauci. He should have. But, Trump's instincts were right. And to some extent, he was trying to keep the economy open in some sort of balance. He didn't do nearly as good a job as DeSantis in Florida. My pick for the first, assuming Biden lives for the next 4 years, but my pick for the first woman to get elected as president as a long shot. But I think the governor of South Dakota, she has been brilliant. Oh, yeah. She didn't close down at all. She just kept telling people what the risks were. And so she did even less than, Florida. And right. It was and she's been pilloried in the press, but her numbers look as good as North Dakota's, similar states around her.
I wonder if I can ask some questions related to law, and particularly in Australia. You can't. Are you allowed to leave Australia? What are the rules around that?
Well, is this being recorded?
Yes, it is.
Let me speak hypothetically about people in the abstract, no names mentioned. Mm-hmm. The rules in Australia are you're not allowed to leave as a citizen, but you can apply for the government's permission to leave. And they have a list of things. And if you have a very ill parent and you make a very strong case, then some middle-level, annoying, officious bureaucrat might deem to allow you to leave. You have to write and promise that they can't guarantee they'll ever let you back in. So two hypothetical people who might now presently be in hotel lockdown in Brisbane would have had to have done this back in November. And when you fill out these forms, they're honest, but they're honest in the same way that when you read someone's curriculum vitae is honest. There's a relationship to the truth, but of course it's being written with an eye to achieving a certain purpose. But it is disgraceful that as a citizen, you can't leave. No, we're not talking about coming in. I can see closing the border. You can't leave.
It's North Korea.
It's like East Germany. I'm waiting for the border guard. So this and this has made Morrison immensely popular. And Jacinda Ardern, I don't know, New Zealanders for the last 15, 20 years have had a standard of living 2/3 of Australians. And that's not going to go up. I mean, you've basically killed your tourism sector. We have two. And now you're soon going to move on and kill the agricultural sector with your global warming stuff. So, I don't know what New Zealand's plan is to make a living. It's pretty, I lived there 11 years. I love New Zealand, but I'm in a bit of despair for the place.
I think we're going to make Hobbit movies for as long as possible. What about coercions that we've seen in Australia? Because it's been quite surprising, shocking even actually, to see the police response to resistance there. I just can't fathom it. It's Australia. It's right next door, same kind of culture as ours, and yet the police actions I just find astounding.
Well, I never thought I'd say this. I grew up in a middle class household in Toronto, and the basic attitude that was instilled in me is that the police were always right. If a police officer brought me home to my dad, I would have been walloped no matter what I said. My basic attitude, I went through law school and I was taught by some sort of South Africans who had this massive dislike of the police. And I used to hate it. The idea that the police, my core instinct was always pro-police. And the last year has just been eye-opening to have police officers go into a pregnant woman's house in Victoria and handcuff her because she put something on the internet in favor of a skeptical lockdown protest. Any half-decent sort of politician would have fired that police officer's boss. And the kind of things that they're doing in Britain, I have lost, a lot of respect for the police. I know that it's not the fault of a lot of the junior officers on the street. And I know a lot of them, actually, there was a couple at the airport who do what they can to ameliorate and soften the application of what they realize are idiotic rules. But, I don't want to overstate this, but it has become obvious that sort of Pinochet type regimes, it's where the police and the general sheep-like behavior of the public comes from, because we're seeing it everywhere here. And yes, you're right, I've become very disappointed in the police. I'm not sure I'd go out of my way to help the police do anything. I've become so, I don't think it hits the lower ranks, but the upper ranks of the police service across the Anglosphere, they have become woke, cancel culture, politically correct people who in Victoria say, rather than try to deal with the Somalian gangs, or in England, in the north of England, rather than deal with rape gangs that were active for months and ignored by the police, they would rather go after some person who's on a beach not wearing a mask by themselves. So this is just shameful. And I know that it's very difficult as a low-level police officer to ignore direct sort of orders, but it has been a disgrace, and I can't find anything good to say about it at all.
You mentioned at the outset around legal challenges. Are there any in Australia? Are any sort of milling about? And you indicated that you didn't think it was very likely that these things would get any traction.
Look, the thing about, let me take it off this topic for a sec. One of the reasons I hate bills of rights is all you ever get is on contentious issues where people disagree, you end up with the views of the lawyerly cast of judges. On big ticket issues where people are panicking, the judges always fall in line. So when they rounded up the Japanese in America during the Second World War, the US Supreme Court didn't stand up for the Japanese. In Korematsu, they said, go ahead, right? And of course, when things calm down then, and people disagree then, and so on any big ticket issue where there's sort of hysteria, you can't ever point to an example where the judges will stand up for sense, right? And so this going in, and in a way it's understandable. I don't want these decisions made by a bunch of unelected sort of committees of ex-lawyers. So no one would really expect the judges to stand up to the politicians, given the hysteria that's been created. And a lot of these judges would feel that hysteria too, because they tend to be old and they probably have a lot of the comorbidities, right? So saying that, I think anyone who actually thought that a legal challenge that went to a top court would see these things overturned in the first year or two just really didn't understand and didn't know much about the legal situation. As time wears on, it becomes more likely. The one case where I thought there was a big chance to win in Australia was the border cases, because we're a federation, and Section 92 of the Australian Constitution seemed to make it a very arguable case that these tin pot premiers couldn't just close their borders the way they've been doing. I'm starting to think that Prime Minister Morrison is worse than Turnbull. I'm a sort of right of center guy, and I hated Turnbull, but Morrison might be worse. The minute the federal government dropped from the challenge, so a crazy billionaire took a challenge to the borders thing, and at first the federal government was involved in the challenge against the states, but once the federal government dropped out, the High Court of Australia, the top court, was never going to side against the border closures. They just weren't going to do it. But had the central government stayed with that challenge, there was a very good chance it would win. And so Morrison who has never involved the states in anything, has created this national cabinet that's nowhere mentioned in the Constitution, and it's sort of this body he's created, and it's been a complete disaster. And a lot of it goes back to Morrison himself. But if you're waiting for the judges to fix this, I don't think it's gonna. It'll happen 3 or 4 years down the road if we're still in this situation. But till then, forget it. It's going to have to happen through the political process.
So Australia and New Zealand are in very similar situations, low levels of COVID or zero.
Your rugby organizers and your rugby rugby administrators are much better than ours, but leave that aside. We're in the same similar situation other than that.
Yeah. So what's your prediction, if put it that way? What's your expectation about the way things will pan out for us this year? What is the exit strategy for New Zealand and Australia?
The exit strategy for Scott Morrison is to have an election before he has to, turn off the financial monetary tap. So he needs to get that election, and then he'll have 3 years to, because the consequences are coming, and I think they know they're coming. I'm a little bit loath to make predictions because I never would have thought it could go on this long. I never would have thought people would be so sheep-like. There are a lot of people in Australia who think that things are great here. They've got a job, they work at the university, or they work for the civil service, and the restaurants are open. And, I've just come back from London for 7 weeks. We put our money where our mouth was. We went out on the tube every day. We walked around. We basically paid attention to as few rules as we could, and we broke quite a few of them. We never associated with anybody old. We applied what we thought we knew, and it's been fine. But people in Australia think that there's death on the streets in London. What there is are empty streets. In a way, I think Britain's going to come out of this better because at least the one thing that they have done right is they have, to my shock and surprise, have run a brilliant vaccination program. More people have been vaccinated in Britain than the entire EU. And I was a Brexiteer, so this is a delight for me. The only thing Boris has done right is Brexit. And so Britain will be up and running in the next year, no matter how slow it is, they'll be up and running. I'm just wondering what Australia and New Zealand's plan is, because if you're going to close down on one case or 5 cases, even the vaccine's not going to stop that. I just don't know what the end game is. I mean, hopefully the end game is that we get a political party, and I noticed that Nigel Farage in England has started an anti-lockdown party. And one of the things that gave us Brexit wasn't the Tory party, it was Nigel Farage single-handedly was responsible for that. If you like it the way I do, he's the guy. In order to push Boris and the Tories, you need someone to the right, not to the right, but on the other side of the issue. And Farage and Lawrence Fox is starting a party. They might provide that. In Australia and New Zealand, there's no sign of that. Preferential voting in Australia makes it very hard for any party that's not one of the main two to have any say. And if there's a voting system worse than preferential voting in the whole world, it would be MMP. You pretty much have to go. The MMP was designed by the American military and imposed on Germany to make them make it impossible to do anything. And if there's one voting system in the world you wouldn't copy, it's Germany's. But of course, New Zealand did. So I don't really know with the 2 voting systems we have, how easy it's going to be able to achieve anything in the short term. But I think the Brits are going to be looking good in 8 or 9 months. And as your readers, listeners will know, I mean, half the US is already open. If you go to Florida or Texas, they had 20,000 people at the Super Bowl. I mean, they're just treating it the way you should treat it in Florida. Almost everything's up and running in big chunks of the US. Yes. My native Canada is a mess.
It certainly does seem to be the issue for our 2 countries. We've had a good virus time period. It feels, it might feel okay to us now, but I just don't quite know how it's going to look in a year's time. Well, best of luck to us both. James, thank you very much for your time and persevering to join us. I really appreciate that.
Thanks to everybody, and go and enjoy your beer. If anyone's from Dunedin, I love the place. My kids grew up there, and it was a fantastic place to live.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Okay, everyone, that draws to a close the symposium. Thank you very much for bearing with us and bearing through everything. In fact, I found it remarkably easy to do that. It was there was a lot of information, a lot of perspectives, and I enjoyed all of it. I hope you did too. it was certainly worthwhile putting it together. I appreciate you all taking the time to do it and to join in. I don't know that we're going to do this again. There may be an opportunity to do it. There may be a need to do it. But best wishes to you all for 2021. Thank you very much. Okay.